was no individual freedom, grow into the person that you want to be type thing. It was, this is what it means to be a good Roman, this is what it means to be a good Athenian, and this is how it works. And so he says, we don't want that anymore, right? We want people to develop individually in their own types of ways. Now, last thing on the bottom I have here, representation. And I put that down is because he says that's the modern institution. So let me explain. Particularly in ancient Athens, right, it was direct democracy. You didn't delegate your role in government to anyone. You directly participated in the government. And in fact, in Athens, they didn't have elections. They drew officers by lot, because it was understood that that was the most fair. So if you were an Athenian citizen, which of course meant you were male and not a slave and a foreigner, you could randomly become what was their president for a year. And that's just how it worked. He was drawn by lottery. But what Constant says is, he didn't want to live in that world. Now think about it. How many of you would like to just randomly be chosen to be a senator? 6 years of your life. Okay, sorry, you gotta go Washington, D.C. Done, you don't get a choice in this. Most of us would be like, I've got other things to do. I've got a family. I've got a job. You can't just send me to D.C. Like, that's a travesty. So what do we do instead? We elect people, right? We have representation. We're not going to, each of us, go to Washington, D.C. We don't have the time to be involved in policy and politics ourselves. So we delegate this, right? Through elections, through representation. He says that's the proper modern equivalent of democracy. So a couple of things that I want to point out here is that he wants us to notice that what we count as liberty is historically contextualized. He says what liberty meant to the ancient Athenians is not what liberty means to us. It's not a universal idea of liberty that's always completely there, but that is actually defined by the types of goals and things that we value in society. If we value commerce, if we value individual decision-making, if we value freedom of speech, our democracy is going to look different than ancient democracy. So it's not a universal model, it's a historically contextualized model. Now, a little bit of a point here to tag on to Jim's talk earlier is that this is in fact what the Founding Fathers thought. They did not want an ancient Greece style of democracy. And they make that very clear in the Federalist Papers, particularly in Federalist 9. It's very clear that they knew that ancient democracies had a lot of problems and were not the type of situation that could work in the modern world. So what you see the Founding Fathers doing actually in the Federalist Papers is to try to create a hybrid between ancient democracy, sort of bring it into the modern world. And they do that through a number of particular institutions, specifically federalism and separation of powers, where they're trying to bring democracy forward. So that's a little bit of insight. So what Constant is recognizing here is that with moving into modernity, we've reached a sort of point of no return, where we can't go back to this world of ancient democracy that in particular the French Revolution so valorized. This idea of direct participation in government, this idea of collective decision-making, that this is not in fact available to us anymore. And here he summarizes it. He says, it follows from what I have just indicated that we can no longer enjoy the liberty of the ancients, which consisted in an active and constant participation in collective power, direct democracy. Our freedom must consist of peaceful enjoyment and private independence. Let us mistrust, gentlemen, this admiration for certain ancient memories. And there he's speaking directly to those French revolutionaries who really wanted to revive ancient Greek democracy. He's saying, look, guys, that's not where it's at. That's just going to create more bloodshed and terror. That's not the type of liberty that's going to work. We can't go back to that. So he says here in one of his most famous quotes, since we live in modern times, I want a liberty suited to modern times. Since we live under monarchies, I humbly beg those monarchies not to borrow from ancient republics the means to oppress us. And those means, he specifically is referring to censorship, to ostracism, to strict rules of education, to restriction of religious liberty. Those are the specific things that he he's talking about that France was trying to implement. Okay, so straightforward so far, right? Liberty of the ancients of the past, liberty of the moderns is the one we have now. We should embrace the liberty of the moderns, hip hip hooray, commerce is here. This is wonderful. Okay, so not so fast. Constant is going to take yet another turn on us. So the question is, okay, so if we can't have ancient liberty anymore, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Is modern liberty a good thing? Is that something that we should be happy that we're getting? So as I put it on this slide, is this a progress or a regress? Is this a going up or sort of going down? And he says here, and here's where we get a little bit of this turning point in the essay. He says, okay, we've got these differences. As he says here, I said at the beginning that through their failure to perceive these differences, otherwise well-intentioned men caused infinite evils during a long and stormy revolution. What he's saying there is the French revolutionaries didn't get this distinction between ancient and modern liberty. It's caused endless violence in France, endless struggles. But then he said, God forbid that I should reproach them too harshly. The error itself was excusable. Okay. Why? He says, one could not read the beautiful pages of antiquity, one could not recall the actions of its great men, without feeling an indefinable and special emotion which the notion of modernity cannot possibly arouse. So he's saying there's something actually beautiful about the ancient model that we're not getting it. There's something beautiful about the self-sacrifice, about the political engagement, right? Okay, so let's see where he goes with this. So he's concerned that we can't go back. We can't recreate the ancient world, but he's also concerned that we're going to lose it entirely. So to explain this passage, I want to go to another piece in Constant's work where he says there's two parts of human nature. There's two aspects to human beings. I'm having this up here. There's one part of us that's self-interested, that relies primarily on sensory perception. By sensory perception, I mean the things that we can touch, that we can taste, that we can feel, that we experience directly. That those things are important to us. And lastly, this is the part of ourselves that's primarily concerned with happiness. This is gratification of the self. And the things that we do to gratify ourselves, right? Which are primarily commerce, which are primarily finding happiness in life, finding a happy day, doing things that will make us happy individual beings. That's one part of us. But he says there's this other part that we actually can't neglect. And this is the part of us that's religious, that loves, that needs glory. Now when he says glory, that's code for martial valor. That's fighting and sacrificing yourself on the battlefield, dying for your country. So glory isn't just like hip hip hooray, I want a track race, that would be great. But what he's thinking about here is there's part of the human condition that wants to sacrifice yourself for glory. So he says we need that. We have devotion and we find beauty in nature. And he says there's this sort of two parts to us. And I included a quote here at the bottom. He says man does not only need rest, industry, domestic happiness, private virtues. Okay, that's the things on this side, right? We not only need happiness, self-interest, Amazon, iPhones, commercial value, right? We not only need this over here, but we actually also need, as he says here, nature has given us other faculties, if not nobler, at least more brilliant. Which are these over here? Religion, love, need for glory, devotion. Now he says, what's common to all of the things on this side is that there are things that call for human beings to transcend themselves. What do I mean by transcend? To think outside yourself, right? Religion asks you to think about God. Love asks you to think about someone else. Glory asks you to think about the nation, about something bigger than you. Nature also asks you to think about something outside yourself. So he says we have this other aspect to ourselves that allows us to sacrifice ourselves and our own self-interest, our own happiness, the things that would make us, give us the greatest pleasure, for something bigger. So he says, but let's step back a moment. There actually are these other things that are important to us. Okay. So then he has a number of important quotes here that I summarized where he talks about this idea about self-interest versus sacrifice. And what he's worried about, if we go back to our distinction about ancient and modern liberty, is he worries that while we have modern liberty now, we may also be losing the capacity for sacrifice and for transcendence. And we may be losing an important part of the human condition. That if we go too far in modern liberty, that we're losing something that is actually central to human nature. So if you remember a couple minutes ago, I said he has a contextualized view of human liberty. Well, now we're seeing him kind of say a little bit of the opposite, which is that human beings perennially always have these two aspects to them. But the point that he's bringing out is that on modernity, we really lean towards the individual happiness, self-interested side, whereas the ancient world leaned much more towards the self-sacrificing side, the giving up to the community side. But he's worried that we need to keep both of those at the same time. So here at the very end of his essay, he's written all this, he's talked about the glories of modern liberty, the benefits that it gives us, the freedom of speech that we have that we didn't have before, the freedom of religion that we had that we didn't have before, many of the benefits of modern liberty. But at the very end, he says here in this very stirring quote, he says, "Moreover, gentlemen, is it so evident that happiness of whatever kind is the only aim of mankind?" Remember, happiness for him is this surrogate word for modern liberty, for commercial liberty, for individual liberty, right? He says, is that all we want out of life? Sure, it's important, but is that everything? And he says, "No, sirs, I bear witness to the better part of our nature, that noble disquiet which pursues and torments us, that desire to broaden our knowledge and develop our faculties. It is not to happiness alone, it is self-development that our destiny calls us. And political liberty is the most powerful, the most effective means of self-development that heaven has given us." So now he's going back on himself. Remember, I just told you. He says, we don't need ancient liberty. That was for small societies that had slaves and engaged in war all the time. But now he's saying this political liberty, that's the liberty of the ancients, the liberty to engage in self-government. He says we can't lose that. That's still important. Sure, it may not be the most important thing, but he says that's still important. And why? He says it's because we still have this part of our nature that can transcend ourselves. We still have this part of our nature that wants to look outside the self for glory. And he says engaging in the political process allows us to do that. It allows for this self-development to occur. And I just want to say one more thing before I finish, just to think about this. Is I know when I asked you the question about voting, of course you were all thinking, election, there's an election. Who knew? I had no idea there was an election. But I want you to think about a reason that Constant is giving you here to be involved in the political process, in voting and thinking and dialoguing with friends and being a part of this. And he says because it allows you, even if for a moment, to step outside of your own self-interest. Step outside of the things that are most important to just you and think about the larger picture for a moment. And he says that in itself is a kind of healthy process whereby the self is thinking about the other, where you're thinking about what's good for the nation, what's good for Illinois, what's good for my community. And he wants us to recognize that even in in the way that we're consumed in modernity, with commercial liberty, with all those good things that come with that freedom, of individual freedoms, that we also need to not lose sight of the importance of political liberty and of what that can add to us as human beings. He wants us to recognize that that's still part of human nature, even though we don't live in the type of societies where we can exercise direct democracy. So just a little bit of food for thought. I'm happy to take some questions. decide that the best political stance for you to take is not to vote, but actually to go through that process to explain it to yourself is actually good. Whereas most people don't vote not because they have a really strong political position, but just because they're apathetic. And I think that's what he would say is the problem, is that just that sheer apathy shows a sort of level of self-interest that's sort of gone wild, so to speak. But even the act of, because I understand that, I totally understand that, like feeling, well, none of this really represents me. And he says that's in fact the problem, that's in fact the real struggle of modern democracy, is that we don't feel like we have a say. In ancient democracies, you knew you could actually get up and make a speech and change policy, which we have records of people doing, just getting up, making a speech, inciting people to go to war, that you might do it. But for us, it feels so much less efficacious than that. It seems like it doesn't do it. So I think his answer would be, even that fact of thinking through that process in itself is a valuable endeavor, that we need to put ourselves through as citizens in order to sort of maintain that credibility. Yes, sir.
So you said that Constant felt that by people voting, it required them to kind of look outside themselves, decide what's best for the, in your case, state of Illinois, country, U.S. So what would you think about, I would suspect, some significant part of our country that votes for whoever's going to give them the most stuff?
Absolutely.
Where does that play into?
Absolutely.
It seems like that's not.
Yeah. Well, the second piece that I did not have time to get into here is that he is really a proponent of federalism and local government. So his solution would be that what makes us really better people, if we're going to think about it, is that we would have to sit down in the same room as people of the opposite political persuasion and work out practical problems like how to build roads, or how to fund schools, or how to sort of make really basic decisions that are sort of in the common good. So I think his antidote to part of that would be to say we actually need a lot more devolution of power to local governments, where people can have that sort of quasi early democracy participation, where it can be more efficacious. I think that would be his answer. I didn't get into it here, but he's a big proponent of local government, small government, subsidiary type of setup.
Which was the 10th Amendment, states' rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thinker, Tocqueville, who he's very similar to, comes to America. And he basically says the reason American democracy is working and French democracy is not working is that American democracy is highly decentralized. And what happened very early on in France during this revolutionary process is that very, very quickly the provinces, their powers were dramatically taken away and all relocated to Paris. And this happened very, very quickly at the beginning of the French Revolution, that there were plenty of parts of France that didn't want the revolution, so they basically had to be suppressed and in some places violently massacred parts of France in order to get on the bandwagon of the revolution. So he sees this as a problem, that you need to let the variety of localism be what it is. And Tocqueville thought that's why America was successful and then France was not. Bill?
So with the ending paragraph, political decision-making process being important for self-development,
Yes.
did he not think that the virtues existed within the modern context? It was just rule following, or did he have some sort of notion that there too were virtues, but different virtues?
You mean in modern commerce?
Yeah, in the modern framework of individual rights, commerce, I'm worried about myself. Does that exclude virtues, or is it just a different set of
No, I think he
virtues?
thought that that was valuable too, and I think he would have said that the ancient world went too far in its own way, right? That they neglected certain types of virtues that commerce brings out, because he obviously thinks freedom of religion is a huge virtue, tolerance, huge virtue. And many of these things that commerce brings us are genuine, real goods that have to be valued. But he thinks our tendency in modernity is to lose a certain set of virtues which correspond to religion, truly sacrificial love, sacrifice for country, patriotic, self-governance. Those are the virtues that we're losing. But we have a different set, which would be the ones that the ancient world didn't know about toleration and religious respect for one another.
So he's not McIntyre.
No. He's very clear that we cannot go back and we should not go back because that would be another reign of terror. We should not try to institute the previous era. He said that's not possible. But he does think that by some sort of federalism system that we can retain enough of the old to sort of give an antidote to commercial provisionism. Anything else? Yes, sir.
And you said that Constantine believed in historically contextualized rights, correct? Then
Yeah.
does that mean that they're changeable, or are there any universal ones that everyone has throughout all time?
Yeah, this is a great question. There's his biggest work that's almost never read. It's actually a book on religious development that is huge for multi-volume, massive work. And the basic argument of that is that there's a sort of progress in human history. That human history has a direction in the sense of kind of moving towards a certain type of ideal. So I think he would say that there are some human liberties that are natural to human beings, but were primarily obscured in certain centuries that you couldn't see for various reasons, just because of, here he's sounding a lot like Adam Smith or Ferguson or someone else, just like a sort of stadial view of human development, that at certain stages you're not going to be able to see. Certain rights aren't going to come out. Like, he's very clear that Christianity is what brings about the abolition of slavery. He says we don't know people are equal until Christianity shows up on the scene and tells us this. But he sees Christianity as sort of a purification, and here he's sort of Neoplatonic of earlier religions, right? It's not a complete departure, but it's a purification and the natural, true development of those earlier pagan religions. I don't know if that answers your question. But yeah, so he would say they would be natural, but they wouldn't be available. The fact that people should be slaves, for instance, wouldn't be available to people in the natural world as an obvious truth, but it is in fact a truth that's borne out in the natural life of history.